and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm Robin Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solved podcast. This is work that's changing our world for the better in all sorts of ways. This time I'm with Dr. Victoria Bemmer and Noorin Khamisani to explore some exciting research into recycling the plastics in our clothes. Synthetics have many positives, being lightweight and durable, but we've all heard the downsides of fast fashion, the complexities of recycling plastic, and things like microbeads and microfibres affecting wildlife. Victoria and Noorin are finding ways to use enzymes to break down the plastics in clothes we don't wear anymore, a process that could require low energy, be more environmentally friendly, and good for our own health as well. Thank you both very much for joining me today. So when you think of plastic, you don't immediately jump to clothing. I think it's usually bottles or the sort of cardboard that you have in your home cupboards and things like that. It's never what's actually on our bodies and what's in the fashion industry. So how is plastic at the moment being used with the clothes that we're wearing?
So a huge amount of our fabrics are made of plastics. So the sort of names that you'll see on your care labels would be polyester, nylon, polyamide, acrylic, things like that. So these are all part of this kind of group of synthetics that are plastic fabrics. And if we think about the kind of market share, it's about 62% of the textiles that are used are synthetics, mainly polyester. So it plays a huge role, and specifically in fast fashion garments. These plastic fabrics are, of course, very strong, and they're, produced in huge quantities. There's a lot that can be done creatively with the fibers to create all different looks. But they are, also fairly cheap in comparison to natural fibers. So that's why they're being used a lot by fast fashion brands.
And how long has this been happening? How soon did the plastic revolution in fast fashion come about, and how excited were people at that time?
Well, I would say the role of sort of synthetics in our fibre use in fashion, it predates fast fashion, really. A lot of these textiles were created to replace natural fibres. For example, acrylic was created to be a cheaper version of wool. Polyester was mimicking silk. So it predates that, but certainly fast fashion has accelerated all of that and also changed our relationship with clothing. So not only are we buying more, but we're using less. And I think that's actually one of the key issues we have to think about in this kind of the role of fast fashion is our relationships with our clothing and the fact that we're not using them long enough or enough. Yeah.
And you said there about durability is one of the key factors of why synthetics were introduced, but it's also how the item of clothing looks once it's been made, because it creates a sort of a shiny effect or a silk effect, like you said.
Well, again, it really depends. You can actually do anything with these synthetics. You can imitate and transform the fibre structure in all different ways. And then depending on how you spin the yarn and how you weave or knit, they're extremely versatile because at polymer stage, you can be changing them to imitate anything you want, really.
So I suppose you probably had a lot of people who wouldn't be able to, say, like afford silk, for instance, and because synthetics came about, they could look like their celebrity idols or someone that probably had a very big income compared to them.
Yeah, and of course, historically, fashion was always associated with this idea of showing status, through what you're wearing. But I think that's also the complexity, though, is that although these synthetics may look like a natural fibre, they won't perform in the same way. They're not breathable, so you can get quite sweaty in them. They hold their smells as well. So there's a lot of other kinds of issues that they can't completely replace, and they can't imitate everything that a natural fibre can do.
So we'll come back to the smelly clothing in a moment. We're going to touch on that in a second. So we're talking about long-lasting and durable, which is great. But a lot of people that buy into fast fashion don't necessarily keep it for the length of time that it can last. And Victoria, that's where you sort of come in what you're trying to find a resolution to that with the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so what we find is sort of around 90% of polyester textiles, they don't get recycled. They end up either in landfill or like the natural environment as a whole. So what we're trying to do in the Centre for Enzyme Innovation is we're trying to develop new methods for recycling those polyester textiles.
And for anyone who isn't aware, what is the Centre for Enzyme Innovation? Because that in a title was pretty epic. It sounds like something out of a superhero film.
If only I was a superhero.
So what do you guys actually do?
So we're working with enzymes, which are like small biocatalysts. So what they'll do is they'll take a polymer, and they almost act as like molecular scissors to like cut it in specific places. So we can break down our polymers and then make a new polymer with it, or we can kind of take those parts of the chain off and make other things with them. Like we can actually make vanillin from some of the monomers from a polymer chain. So we started working on PET bottles, so like your disposable water bottles that you get. So we started working on the recycling of them, and so we're now moving into textiles.
And how revolutionary is it moving into textiles when it comes to enzyme innovation?
So the problems that we have with textiles is the way they're manufactured. The chains end up like a lot more rigid. So they're harder for our enzymes to break down. Also, when we're making textiles, they tend to have a lot of additives present in them that we don't see in plastic bottles. So things like the dyes to make like your shirt, whatever color you want it. There are often things like fire retardants added to fabrics that just aren't present in the plastic bottles. And we just don't know how those are going to impact how our enzymes work.
And you're saying there, so obviously it seems like a huge task to even, break down the plastic that's in our clothing to a point where you can rebuild it back up. But when you do get to that point where you've broken it down and you can reuse it, what are you doing with them? How are you reforming them?
When we've got those broken down, we can sort of separate them out into the different types that they are. And then it's just a case of we would do the exactly same process that they're doing when you take a fossil fuel to make a plastic. So that heating it up in the presence of another catalyst.
So it's almost like very scientific Jenga. You just pushing them in.
That's the way you can think about it. It's like we're cutting this long chain into a series of blocks, and then we can reassemble those blocks. And we want to do that because some of the typical recycling methods that we have at the moment, things like mechanical, we're not breaking that chain down at all. And when we reuse these plastics, when we reuse the plastics, they end up being like weaker and things like that. So they don't maintain the properties that people like about plastics in the first place, like how durable they are, how strong they are, things like that.
And just tell us a bit about one of the recent projects that you guys worked on. Was it polyester that you'd managed to break down?
Yes, we're working on polyester at the moment. That's our real focus. So even as a scientist, I'm like always a little bit like I forget. Chemically, like your polyester shirt is exactly the same as the PET bottles that we're using. So they should be broken down by our enzymes. It's just like the structure is different on them.
And aside from the obvious positives of recycling the plastics in our clothes, we've touched on a few of them here. In theory, if this process was effective and it could be mass produced on a larger scale, in the long run, save energy as well, right?
Yeah, so one of the appeals of like using enzymes to break down plastics is they generally need much lower temperatures than things like chemical breakdown, even just like burning the plastics. So it's lower temperature than would be required under normal circumstances. And the solutions that we're working in are quite environmentally benign because enzymes are a natural molecule, so they don't react well to harsh conditions. So we're usually like working in like a water-based solution.
And Noorin, microfibers as well are another area of concern, I think, for a lot of people. Can you just explain to people, for anyone that isn't aware, what is a microfiber when it comes to our clothing?
A tiny piece of plastic that is coming away from the yarn. So, when we create fabrics, let's say, we have tiny fibers and we twist them together into a yarn, and then that yarn is then woven or knitted into a fabric. And then every time we wash that fabric, those microfibers are being released through the washing machine sort of process. So, I mean, it's one of these areas, though, that is still quite new. I think there's still research going on to actually understand what is the impact. But we know that these microfibers are being released through us just laundering our clothing. So again, people just not knowing, you buy a garment, you stick it in the washing machine, and you don't realize that you're going to be, impacting creatures in the ocean, right? We're so disconnected from the full kind of impact of that. But yeah, I mean, it's huge. Apparently, over a third of all microplastics discharged into wastewater are coming from synthetic clothing. So this is very much a sort of fashion industry problem.
Definitely. And you work with Revolution Plastics here at the university. Can you just walk us through some of the stuff that you're doing specifically with them?
Well, we're collaborating actually with Victoria as well, and we're getting ready for a conference actually that we're going to have, which is looking at the role of plastics broadly across the conference.
We'll go back onto the smelly sportswear comment from earlier. How do these microfibers affect things like sportswear?
Well, I think the way I think about it is that, there is a certain role for sort of plastics in terms of the things that we need to have within textiles or fashion broadly. But I think there's a big question mark again around sort of appropriateness of use. So if we're going to use plastics, let's use them in the most appropriate places. So I would say that fast fashion, which is something that's created to last a very short time, is completely inappropriate to use such a long-lasting fiber. And also I would say in sportswear it's very difficult to be using plastics because sportswear, of course, you're going to wear it, you're going to sweat, and you're going to have to wash it again over and over again. So then every time you're washing it, you're releasing those microfibers. So again, it's a sort of question mark. So where can we use polyesters in a more appropriate way? So I would suggest potentially shoes, or raincoats, where you want those properties, where it is something durable, it's something you're buying for a really long time, and something that isn't laundered very often. But again, as I said, this area is still very much under research. I mean, I know there's a project in Sweden where they're actually looking at whether there's something in the sort of construction of the fabrics that can be done to start to minimize some of that microfiber shedding. So there's so many different areas that we need to look at. But I think one of the quickest fixes, if we're thinking of, say, fashion designers specifically, I think choosing very carefully where we use synthetics could make a difference really quickly.
Sweden, they're always leading the charge, aren't they? I'm still very sore about Eurovision, but we'll move on. No, and I mean, like Nike, for instance, they are the funders of the FA and the women's team, the women's kit, and you've got the Women's World Cup coming up, and they did a story recently where they were promoting the fact that they're using recycled material for the kit, and they're really excited and shouting about that. But actually, what alternatives could they use other than recycled synthetics? Would it make more sense to use maybe something like cotton? Or
I mean, certainly I think cotton would be a great alternative, and even better if it was organic and fair trade cotton. Certainly, and even hemp could be another great alternative. I think in general for sportswear, if you can be using natural fibers, because those things are going to be worn so often. For me, polyester is completely inappropriate. But actually, I saw today that there's a lawsuit in the States that's been taken out against Nike for greenwashing. So I think that's also another area that there's a lot of confusion, really, in terms of the language. So even the way that, and it's not just Nike, it's a lot of big brands, but they talk about their use of polyester as like, oh, well, it can be recycled, which is really sustainable. But again, as we've discussed earlier, there's complexities to recycling. It's not a perfect system. It's not, oh, we've done it, we fixed that problem. There's still a lot to explore in terms of actually getting that recycling to work really well, to make sure the infrastructure's in place, to make sure things aren't ending up in landfill, the energy use, as you touched on as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well is like a lot of the issues that we have with plastic recycling is it ends up with a downgrading of the material's properties. So like a typical life cycle that you could almost think of, if you're lucky, it will then maybe get recycled into a polyester shirt. And then because of the degrading in the properties, it might then end up in a carpet tile. And then once we've hit the carpet tile stage, there's nothing else that can be done with that polyester. And then it just goes to landfill. So it's not a circular system at all.
And that's the thing. You always think when you say recycling, it's endless recycling and endless opportunities. But that's not the case, is what you're saying.
No, I think that's the dream, is to be able to produce that truly circular economy. But we're nowhere near that yet in the recycling.
Especially within the fashion space, a lot of brands are making huge claims and kind of, making consumers feel like, oh, it's fine that I'm buying polyester because it will be recycled, or it is made of a part of recycled polyester. And I don't know, sometimes we're dealing with sort of levels of badness, but I think there needs to be more transparency and more clarity over, what is the technology right now? What are we working towards? But what claims can we really make right now?
I suppose it's very fashionable to be environmentally conscious as a brand at the moment.
I think that's the most important thing is there's this kind of leap to recycling, but actually we should be doing lots of things before that. We should be reducing, reusing, recycling should be almost the worst case scenario.
Rather than the first thing.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for talking with me. It's been really interesting. And whilst the research is still in its early stages, the opportunities for clothing and beyond are really exciting. If you'd like to find out more about plastics in fashion, listen to the full episode of Life Solved on the University of Portsmouth website or your favourite podcast app now. You can also find out about those events happening around plastic and recycling by looking in the comments box below. You can also subscribe. Just head to port.ac.uk/Life Solved. Next time, we continue our investigation into plastics as we unpack INC2, a global gathering of governments with the aim to develop an international, legally binding plan on plastic pollution. See you again then.